I'd like to introduce the newest addition to our state agronomist pool when it comes to the plant and soil sciences, Mr. Brian Pugh. Brian comes out of the Northeast area as an extension specialist, and we've transitioned him into the state forage specialist, and he's also getting a PhD. While he's getting a PhD with Steve Phillips, is that correct? So far. Hey,
ask Dr. Phillips.
Day-to-day changes. Your boss is talking to your other boss, so don't worry.
He was asking if I was still working on a PhD under you, and I was like, yeah, you'd have to ask him. So, is this my one?
All right. With that, Brian's going to handle the grazing, minimum grazing, and then we'll move through. So, Brian, floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. I tend, my volume goes up when I'm speaking in front of a group. Very excited to talk to you today about this topic. This is something I've been very interested in most of my life. Spent the last 20 years really focusing in on how to extend the grazing season for a lot of our forage producers. Again, did a lot of work on the eastern side of the state, branching out a little bit now. But what I hope to do today, when Dr. Arnold said, hey, could you do something on stockpiling Bermuda grass? I said, absolutely, because that's probably the one area that I think I'm most passionate about, and I think it could help the most producers out there in the state reduce their winter feeding system. And anytime we can reduce a winter feeding system by a day or 2 days or maybe even 30 days, what do we end up doing? We put more money back in the producer's pocket, right? And I think that's the name of the game now. Of course, cattle markets are good, so when cattle markets are good, it doesn't matter what inputs cost. Just buy it all, right? But when cattle markets trickle back down, and they will over the next few years, I think Dr. Peel agrees with that. What we will see is that input costs have continued to climb steadily, and we need to be looking at more efficient ways to manage our forage stand. We've seen a steady improvement in efficiency in some of our cropping systems over the last 30 to 40 years. I feel like we're way behind when it comes to forage management, though. How many of y'all know producers that pretty much grow grass the way their granddads did? It's just something that grows out there and we kick cows on it. So we've got to get away from that mindset. We've got to start thinking about how do we treat these forages like crops and manage them more intensively. 3-minute intro slide, Brian. I'll try to speed up a little bit. Thank you. Okay, so again, I'm kind of a low-hanging fruit type of person. I tend to look at the elephant in the room and think that's where we need to focus. And when we look at the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, on producers' cow cost, operation cost, about 50% of what we spend on a cow annually is considered feed cost. All right, and that includes hay, that includes supplement and forage. So again, that's one area where I think we can make the biggest impact is this feed type cost going into this cow. Again, what we do know is if you look at some really good data, Kansas Farm Management Association has some great data off real world operations. And what they show is that some of the most profitable producers actually spend the most on their pasture feed costs, but they spend the least amount on non-pasture feed costs. And the reason is if we're willing to make investments into pasture, into forage, we tend to do away with some of the supplement and hay that we need. And that's the concept we're talking about here today. This was a good rule of thumb in the past. You're going to spend about $1.50 per cow per day for cattle that are needing hay and supplementation. That's based on a $35 bale of hay and about $240 per ton byproduct feed. Fed at 4 pounds per cow. How many of y'all have seen prices higher than this over the last few years? Everybody better raise their hand. What happened about 3 years ago, I think, in the hay market? Maybe that was only 2 winters ago. We were selling some really good pigweed and crabgrass hay for $150 a bale, right? So again, you need to think about that. That's on the low end. My ag economist in Northeast Oklahoma and I worked with some producers that were actually spending over $4 a day just to get a cow through the winter. So that's massive expenditures. And we're not even talking about waste. We're not even talking about equipment to get that out there, the labor to get that out there. So there's a better way to do it, and it's make the cow do the work. And that's kind of the mantra or the theory behind this. This is an old survey that was done by Bob Woods, my predecessor in Northeast Oklahoma. I duplicated that survey back in about 2017. Found very similar results, even though we'd been almost 20 years since the previous survey. And that is that most producers, again, about 80% of producers are feeding more than 120 days of hay and or supplement. That's excessive in my opinion, especially in the state of Oklahoma, because we have opportunities to look at a lot of different warm and cool season forages. And if we manage them correctly, that should meet those cows' requirements through a large portion of the winter feeding period. Okay, so why start with Bermuda grass? Why would we look at Bermuda as the first step for a winter forage system? Who said that? Nobody's going to admit it. I was going to give you $100, whoever admitted to that, but yeah, absolutely. So it is our most dominant warm season perennial forage in the state. As you trickle further west, I mean, we could argue that Old World Blue Stem lays in there too and might service a role, but a lot of people have Bermuda grass in definitely central and eastern Oklahoma. That's what dominates our introduced forage stands. Again, my prediction, my estimate, my guess is that 95% of those producers don't manage it after September 1. And I hear that repeatedly. I think we've done a fair job over the last decade or two trying to convince people to manage that fall Bermuda grass, but we're not there by any stretch. So I hope to get you there after seeing this today. Again, it's already established, it's resilient, it's responsive to N, and it will meet a cow's nutrient requirements, both crude protein and TDN or energy, if we're willing to manage it intentionally. Okay? Not necessarily intensively, but intentionally. So that's going to be an important point we get to. Okay, this is a really nice little graph. This is one of those you could spend 10 minutes on, or you could spend just maybe 20, 30 seconds on. Y'all are good. Come on in. What I do want to point out in this slide is this blue line. That's essentially rainfall through the year. And what we do see in pretty much every county in Oklahoma is we have a bimodal rainfall pattern. So what that means is we're going to get a peak of rain early in the year. We're also going to get a peak of rain in this fall time period. And for those of you, again, our county educators will tell you that's those county fair rains. It always seems to rain somewhere around the county fair. So that is a very rainfall secure period of the year. And that's the rainfall that we're wanting to capitalize on for this late summer fertilized and stockpile Bermuda grass. Now, another thing that I hear from a lot of producers is I'm not going to manage Bermuda after September 1 because of why? It's done, right? It's not going to grow anymore after September 1. Well, if we'll look at this orange bar here, what you're seeing, these numbers would be the amount of cumulative annual forage yield in each month as a percentage. Okay, so if we look over here at September, October, November, it's pretty easy to see that 1/4 of our yield occurs after September 1. What kind of yield can we expect out of Bermuda that's managed correctly in Oklahoma for the year? What will it make per acre? Wow. Everybody's sleepy. 80% rule, Brian. As soon as 80% of them fall asleep, I'm turning the PowerPoint off and sitting down. Don't take that as a challenge, by the way. Let's say common. How much rain? Good question. Let's say 35 inches, central part of the state. We're gonna fertilize it as well. We're gonna use nitrogen on it. What would be your estimate? Yeah, I'd say 5 tons would probably be a good estimate at that kind of 35 to 40 inch rainfall. Of course, it would go down as we go further west, might go up as we go further east. But again, if I can make 4 tons per acre per year and 25% of it comes after September 1, how much is that? It's 1 ton of production after September 1. 1 ton per acre. That's significant. That's more than what, or as much as what unfertilized Bermuda makes per acre per year. How much unfertilized Bermuda do we have in Oklahoma that we run cows on? A whole lot. And it's there to last not only a whole year, but some people bale 6-7 months worth of hay off of that Bermuda as well. Okay, I think I'm going to jump past this one. Actually, we may hit this real quick. I want everyone to understand, very important concept. If we're looking at time on the x-axis, as we progress through either the growing season or the regrowth period for Bermuda grass, we do see yield increases exponentially, sigmoidal type increase. What we also see though is that basically indigestible fiber is laid down in the stem of that plant. To hold all that leaf mass up, it has to lay this indigestible fiber down to grow that stem. Lignin goes up, and therefore the quality of that forage goes down. Not only the quality, but the digestibility of that forage and the palatability of that forage. So that's a key concept to understand when it comes to managing any introduced forage. And what we do know is a lot of times that optimum is going to occur somewhere around 6 weeks of age. Okay? Now let's talk about how that might apply to us in a stockpile Bermuda grass scenario. How do we stockpile Bermuda? I think the most important thing for me is we have to be a little bit particular about terminology. Is stockpile Bermuda grass that I grow in May and June, I defer grazing on it all summer long, and then I turn cows in it in November or December? Is that stockpiled? Okay, that's not what I consider stockpile Bermuda. And if you've ever had a producer that does that, they'll tell you one thing across the board: I couldn't make my cows eat it. There's a reason for that based on that last graph I just showed you right here. How old is that forage? If we grew it in May or June or even July, how old is that forage by the time we get to frost? Extremely old, extremely low quality. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about somewhere around the 1st of September, removing the above ground growth back to a short point to allow regrowth. What's that regrowth going to be quality wise? It's going to be high. We're also going to apply nitrogen to it to increase the yield, but also to boost the quality in the short term. Based on a lot of our trials here at OSU and even other states, we would expect about 1 ton of forage per acre if we put that 50 units of actual in on it somewhere around early September. And the big caveat is what? We get some rain on it, okay? We've got to get that rain to put that nitrogen around the root zone and get uptake. We would target grazing after first frost when growth is complete. And again, use it when you need it. I've had producers say, well, Brian, you told me graze it from November 1 until after Christmas. I run out of grass on October 10th, so my cows stood there starving for 20 days. Is that what Brian means? No, that's not what Brian means. Again, this is a rough rule of thumb to let you understand where we can utilize this in a normal grazing system. It works really well in November to December. And I'll give you a few more tidbits of information a few slides later. If we do this, and if we get that 1 ton per acre, what we can expect is about 45 to 60 grazing days at 1 cow per acre stocking rate. Okay, so it's a pretty easy a calculation for producers to make. 1 cow per acre, I put my 50 units in down, should last me about 2 months. So that's that November to December time period. All right, let's talk about tripping the fall stopwatch. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times producers will think as soon as they fertilize, that starts the stopwatch. That starts the growth of that Bermuda grass forage. Is that the truth? No. We can look at about 4 of the last 5 years, actually, have been some of the driest Septembers and Octobers on record. And what do we see? What actually starts the growth of this stockpile forage? It's rainfall. Okay, so I often say don't get caught waiting on a rain. If you're waiting on one, you're truly waiting on 2. You'll miss a rain very easily if you're sitting around waiting on that. What we do know is, again, we've had quite a few trials on this comparing urea to ammonium nitrate or urea to urea plus agritane. Very few of these trials have actually showed statistical differences there in the fall as far as fall yield goes. But I will tell you this, that if you wait from September 1 until October 1 to put that fertility down, what do you think my reduction in yield is going to be? Fairly significant, okay? So time is probably more critical to you than necessarily getting this down right ahead of that rain, okay? keep that in mind. So that was a trial here. We had 15 days pre-rain. We put down ammonium nitrate, urea, and urea plus agrotane. No statistical differences there. We do see numerical differences. Again, I had 4 other locations that looked at the exact same thing that year. Only one showed a statistical difference, and that was between urea and urea plus agrotane, and it was a very small difference. Okay, here's another trial. I've got some older data in here that kind of shows you this is not new. This has been around a long time. Dr. Talaferro actually worked on some of this way back in the 90s, and that's where we started working on it with Oklahoma State University. But you can see here, nice trend as we increase from 50 to maybe 75, maybe even 100 pounds of actual N or more. That might make us think that we need to be applying more than 50 pounds of N. What becomes the problem with that? I'm going to wake y'all up at some point, I promise. What if I apply September 1 and the first rain happens September 30th? Okay, that was a long time that I put a lot of nitrogen down with no rain. What if that first frost occurs on October 23rd? That was 23 days of growth in October. That's a very short time period. There's no way I can capitalize on 100 to 150 units of actual N. So that's why we try to moderate what we recommend in these fall fertility applications. First ½ inch of rain will move that into the root zone. We'll tend to lock those nutrients in there for the plant to take up, and we'll start to see almost immediate growth with that as well. Okay, so here is the next important concept is where do we stop the stockpiling process? Where does that stop at? If the rain actually initiates it, where's the ending point for stockpiling Bermuda? Josh, you keep looking at me like that, I'm going to call on you. You look like you wanted to say something. Okay, so again, this exact same graph essentially that I showed you a while ago. Crude protein, TDN, is dropping over time. Yield is increasing over time at a slower rate than what we see in the summer. Why is it increasing at a slower rate in September and October? Why does it take more than 6 weeks to drop below a cow's protein and energy requirements? What's that? Heat units, sunlight intensity, day length, temperature. Again, a lot of things going in here to slowing this down, but what I want you to understand is we can't predict the frost. We don't know where the killing frost occurs. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is hit these rough calendar dates to get us in the ballpark. If I have an early frost, what would be a characterization of that stockpile Bermuda for the year? Quantity would be what? Lower. Quality would be higher. Higher protein, higher energy, and we see this every year. If I have a late frost, what would happen? Much more quantity, great hay replacement strategy. Okay, if hay is high, that's a good way to make more hay replacement. But what would the quality be? Probably below that cow's protein and energy requirement and would need some supplementation. Okay, so here was one. I like to show this here. This was some of the Stillwater data from back in the late 90s. We've done this in other spots. I just use this. This was some of Dr. Lawman's original research with the area agronomist at the time. What you'll notice here is from November to December, January, what do you see is happening to not only the crude protein, but also the TDN as we progress into winter? It's dropping, okay? And that is also variable. Some years we drop very little. Some years we drop a lot. What do you think mostly dictates the rate of quality decline? Let's think about that plant. Where's the highest quality portions of that plant itself that we want the cow to graze? The leaf, the top. Somebody said top. The leaf material. That stem is not as high of quality. So what would make those leaves fall off of dormant Bermuda grass? Moisture, rain, okay? The more rain we get, what we see is that degrades faster. We drop more leaves off to the ground. We lose quality faster. Here was another trial. You'll notice here, this one, very good protein. It actually held above a dry cow's requirement, which is 8% crude protein, by the way, into January. Same thing on TDN, and we continue to see this on some of our research cow herds, which I'll show you some data on here in just a minute. Brian, how am I doing?
1 minute in.
Okay, I got 1 more minute and I'll be done.
15 more minutes.
Okay, I can do that easy. All right, so here's a big question we get. Dry fall conditions. Have we had any of those lately? Again, I mentioned earlier, 4 out of the last 5 years have been some of the driest Septembers and Octobers on record. Even if we go back about 130 years in time, we see that's true. This might change the way we need to think about managing forage here in the fall if this continues to be a trend. But what do you think would happen if we went out, we applied 108 pounds urea, that's 50 pounds of N. We got 0.5 inches of rain. That was about 2 days prior to fertility application. About a week later, we got a 1/4 inch, and then through the entire growing period until frost, we got 0.83 inches. By the way, this was in Freedom, Oklahoma. What do you think that's going to look like? Failure? Well, let's look here. This was in 2022. We made 1,280 pounds of dry matter per acre. Not as good as what we wanted to, admittedly. 14.1% crude protein, 62 TDN. Does that meet a cow's requirements? That actually meets a lactating cow's requirements, okay? So very high quality, even though we had less yield. When we calculated that, 49 cow days per acre at 21 pounds of dry matter per day, and that's assuming an 80% efficiency of intake. We actually got 43 days of grazing on that site. So did that add up to being an economical advantage to that producer to have 40-something days of grazing? No hay, no supplement? Absolutely. Okay, now we're getting into this data here from these research stations. I've worked on a few of our research stations to implement year-round grazing systems, again, to try to be a little bit more economically efficient. What we're looking at here would be our Valiant cow herd at the time had 248 head. The cow herd we had at Perkins had 42 head. You'll notice the amount of acreage that we allocated of stockpile Bermuda on both of these sites. I really want to point out the protein and energy values that we saw there. We continue to see protein and energy values above what a cow's requirements are for that winter feeding period. Average yield you'll see is drastically different. This is actually the trap just across from Sonic at Perkins, made almost 4,500 pounds per acre. When we manage it correctly, it makes a really good stand of Bermuda grass. You'll notice here our cost per cow per day. So think back early in my presentation, I said, even if we're willing to feed a cow pretty cheaply with a low amount of byproduct feed and a cheap bale of hay, we're going to have $1.50 per cow per day in her. We're well below that with stockpile Bermuda. And that's fertilized forage. That's high quality forage. Weight change was the other big thing we looked at on these herds. We monitored weight in and weight out off of these forages. And as you can see here, no statistical change in those cows' body weights over those grazing periods. So I'm not going to tell you that stockpile Bermuda is going to put a lot of weight on a cow. It's not going to flesh those cows up rapidly, but what it will do is at least sustain them through a period of the year when we'd normally be feeding hay and supplement. One other thing that I think is important to point out here would be, again, utilization factor. And any time that we improve or maybe tighten up the allocation of forage that we're giving those cows, we reduce their access to that forage, we tend to improve the utilization. And what we looked at was some of these strip grazing opportunities for stockpile Bermuda that works really well, improves our utilization drastically of forage that we've already grown. Whole lot of info here. We don't have to go into that. A lot of people ask, is strip grazing worth it? Yes, it is. We did see less time over that grazing period than what it would take to start a feed truck and go put out hay and supplement. About 1/4 of the amount of time as using a feed truck. We also saw about a 15% increase in utilization by using a 3 to 5 day fence movement versus continuous access. So it was enough to give us 8 additional grazing days on this site here at Perkins, about a $500 savings. which was sufficient to pay for the entire electrified fencing system. Okay, so again, very easy to sell this to most producers, and I've got dozens and dozens that now use this successfully. This was at Valiant at the McLinley Research and Demonstration Farm, one-day fence movements. One thing I can tell you is those cows, they're utilizing every stitch of that, okay? We're not only eating leaf, but we're eating stem as well. If my cows are very thin and I need to add some condition to them, do I want them to graze it that tight? No, because again, we know the quality of that's going to be much below that cow's requirements. Here's our Perkins Cimarron Valley Research Station, same kind of thing, not making them, forcing them to eat quite as much, 3 to 5 day fence movements. We did still saw about 70% utilization on that forage. Cows did really well there on that, as you saw on that previous slide, gained about 2 pounds. What if it's not pure? Get that question all the time. This was a field that in 2020 was about 70% foxtail, had a lot of barnyard grass in it. Normally we'd say that's a complete loss. Actually testing that after frost, it was over 14% protein and 60 TDN, and the cows ate that very effectively in a strip graze scenario. And they did well on that. So again, just because it's not all Bermuda doesn't mean that it is a loss. Some of the things to watch for: take a standing forage sample. That way we know exactly what the quality is. Again, we mentioned that leaves contain the bulk of the quality. Tight grazing will encourage more stem removal. That can be good or bad. That gives us more grazing days, but it also decreases the total quality of that cow's diet on a daily basis. Inclement weather can be a real game changer on stockpile Bermuda. We've all probably seen wheat or fescue pastures that after an ice or snow event, cows go right back out to it and start grazing again. They typically will not do that with stockpile Bermuda. Okay, if you get a lot of ice on it, it's hard to convince them to go back. Lactating cows are really on the edge of their nutrient requirements, so they have to be watched very closely to make sure we're meeting protein and energy requirements for them. Super tight grazing when it's dormant. Is that possible? Yes. Again, if it's totally dormant, it's not going to hurt it for us to graze it on down to the stolons. We may see an increase in spring, cool season weeds and even some warm season annuals that pop up the next year. What I would say is if you're before frost, we need to be more careful about grazing that very tight to the ground. Okay, we can hurt some health of the stand, winter survivability of that stand. My recommendation is if it's before frost and you have to turn in, give them continuous free choice access. Once frost occurs, now we can go back to a strip grazing system and make them utilize a little bit more of that forage. Okay, a few things I want to point out here. This is some actual data off these stations. Again, notice our good quality Bermuda hay at Perkins. Notice 2 years worth of stockpile Bermuda, just as good as what that high quality Bermuda grass hay was. Huge reduction in the amount of hay that we had to feed just by using stockpile Bermuda. And again, we didn't hurt cow body weights. Over a 57-day period, we actually saw a slight increase in cow body weights. Cost-wise, what did that end up? On the Perkins Research Station, the first winter that we did it was about $100 per cow savings, just by having 1 acre per cow of stockpile Bermuda. Okay, so come out to a little over $1 per cow per day. Here's the same thing on our Lindley Research Herd. That's a 2,500 acre research station we have, 270 cows at the time. Again, you'll notice this was actually coastal Bermuda grass hay. And again, very good quality stockpile Bermuda. About a 1 bale per cow reduction on the first year. And we did see a slight decrease in the body weight of those cows. But do you remember what I said we were doing as far as strip grazing? 1 day fence movements. Those cows are really utilizing a lot of that stem. So again, keep those things in mind. Okay, last thing I'm going to leave you with before I wrap it up here. Doing pretty good. I'm right at 30 right now. I was asked to talk about stockpile Bermuda. Again, I hope that gave you a little bit of insight into how that system works. We could talk for hours about it. But there are other forages that we can add into this system to really work on getting a year-round grazing system. Native would be a great one. Okay, so where native really fits is going to be after stockpile Bermuda. We can't hold stockpile Bermuda much past January because of what? Leaf weathering. It's just not going to stand there. Our native forages, on the other hand, will stand there through the winter. Okay, so that gives us more opportunity to come off of stockpile Bermuda onto native. And then we could start to look at a lot of our cool season forage options that we have here in the state to kind of make up the difference until we get to that spring growing period again, that we can start running cows once again on warm season grasses. Some of the things I'm working on right now, trying to push this theory further west. About the last 4 years, I've worked with a few producers on stockpiling Old World Blue Stem. I do have one producer at Freedom that has successfully ran cows, about 70 head of cows on stockpile Old World Blue Stem the last 3 years. So I wanted to go in and look at different nitrogen fertility rates, eventually look at different application dates in a lower rainfall environment on Old World Blue Stem. This is that trial you see here in Woods County. Did this in conjunction with Katie Hiddle, the extension educator there. Again, we put out 0, 50, and 75 pounds of actual N as urea on August 26th. Hit it perfect this year. That night, we actually got about a ½ inch of rain on that site itself. So it was looking really good. On October 2nd, there's what you would have seen if you'd have walked out there, just to let you know how deep that was. It was looking great. And then, is anybody out from that part of the world? Maybe Alva on over towards Freedom. What happened in about that time of year? Small grains pastures, fertilized Bermuda. Okay, rain. What else hit? It was a pest. Armyworms hit. So unfortunately, we lost a lot of the leaf material off of the fertilized portions of the Old World Blue Stem, not the unfertilized. And the producer lost about 60 acres of trit in the very next field. So kind of a wreck for the producer. It was a wreck for the research for this first year. But again, this is something that I will continue to work on in the future to try to get some additional information on. Can we use the same practices that we do with stockpile Bermuda on Old World Blue Stem? Again, if I could give you anything, make the cow do the work. I'm pretty much done, Josh. You can stand up if you want to. Last thing I'll leave you with here, my ag economist and I sat down a few years ago when cattle markets were a little bit more average. And we said, hey, there's a lot of producers not adopting these strategies. How could we put it in a different take or a different format? And what we found was if you looked at 60 days of winter grazing, so that would be like 1 acre per cow of stockpile Bermuda, that was equivalent to about a 42-pound increase in weaning weight at $1.70 calves. That was a 4.8% increase in weaning percentage, or a little over a 5% increase in current market value. So I don't know about y'all. I run cows myself. I'd have a lot of trouble doing that in 1 year to my cow herd. But it'd be much simpler for me to put 50 units of N down at 1 acre per cow in the fall and manage that Bermuda after September 1 and get the same types of returns to my system. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'll leave it at that. I'll take any questions.
Are you seeing any faster green up like in the spring or overall health in the spring based off your fall applications? And is there any like micronutrient work that's done on Bermuda that might transpond to the overall cow's health for the fall application?
Okay, good question on the first one. I have actually had a few trials in northeast Oklahoma where we looked at spring green up and health, and we did see an improvement in stand health where we stockpile in the fall. Now this goes directly against what turf grass tells you, is don't fertilize late in the fall. But the reason that is because they're keeping it short in a vegetative state. We're allowing this plant to grow towards reproductive phase and send a lot of carbohydrates back to the root. So we do see improved root health. Micronutrient work, we have very little micronutrient work on forages here in Oklahoma. I won't step on Brian's toes, but as far as that going into basically nutritional status of a cow, no, I don't know of any of that being done.
No, we want to do that. And not share the radio time.
Out there like a liquid or something that, based on that cost per acre, we would save you mineral or anything like that if we would transplant to that.
Like a foliar liquid
Yeah.
to increase. Now, I haven't seen any of that. Again, I think Brian kind of hit it on the head. If you're on lush forage, we're going to run a high mag mineral for grass tetany. I mean, there's various things we can look at, high selenium minerals. I haven't seen anything where that's applied foliar to the forage, though. Mike.
Two questions. What did you do with the grass before you started stockpiling? And did you bale it up? And also, why didn't you put phosphate and potash out there with
Okay.
your urea?
Two good questions. So I probably jumped over that in the first slide. Again, it says bale it, graze it, mow it. What would be my preference in late August to get that pasture back short? What would I rather see you do as a producer? Graze it. That's the most efficient, economically efficient way. Then bale it and then clip it. Okay. If you've got to shred it, you can shred it. That's important for Bermuda to reset the quality of that plant back to a very high quality vegetative stage. Not as important on fescue. So I've got some work going right now. I'm 2 years into data where clipping is not as important to keep the quality high. But again, it's a cool season forage. But you definitely need to do that for Bermuda and Old World Bluestem. Second part of your question was?
Phosphate and potash.
Okay, you need to do that based on your soil test. Hopefully you did that in the spring. Okay, hopefully you put the P and K down soil test calls for in the spring. Then all we have to do is top dress the end come fall. That would be my hope. If you're extremely P or K deficient and you didn't do anything in the spring, you need to address that in the fall as well to see those types of yields.
Did I hear you right when you said that when you get a freeze on Bermuda, your protein goes up?
No. No. So typically the freeze itself, the frost will lock the quality in the stem. What you will see is weathering, rain on that will degrade the leaf material and quality goes down because we lose the high quality leaf. It falls off the plant. But those graphs I showed December, January, February, that's just natural degrade of the plant, that's degradation of the plant that's happening over a few months. In a stockpile system, in what? When it's 2 days old? That's when it's the highest. And that goes back to that graph. It's going to be the highest quality when it's extremely short. As that plant grows, we tend to dilute protein and dilute energy over time. So that's the trade-off of horse hay versus cow hay. I'm going to bale a little earlier at 28 to 30 days for high quality horse hay, maybe 6 weeks for beef cow hay.
Talking about hay,
Yeah, I saw it in a lot of fields this summer. Matter of fact, identified quite a few different fields here in Payne County with Jennifer Patterson. That's the farthest north I've seen it since I identified it back in like 14. So yeah, I would definitely watch that this next year. If y'all have Bermuda, especially intensively managed Bermuda, we need to be staying on top of this so we know exactly where it's at. But yes, it was very widespread this year.
Are you seeing a difference in the amount of regrowth when you start stockpiling, whether your recommendation was 2 to 3 inches or if you left 5 to 6 inches?
That's a good question. I don't know that we have any work here at Oklahoma looking at that residue from say 2 to 3 to maybe 4 or 5. But that would be something interesting to look at down the road. That's actually what I'm doing with fescue is looking at how important is it to clip it extremely short. Because again, the theory would be if we left it 4 or 5, we've got a few more solar panels there to speed up that regrowth period. That's a good idea. Good future trial right there.
We'll move on. If you guys have any more questions, we'll see if we have some time at the end, but we'll move on so we can make sure to stay somewhat on track.
And we can ask Mike too on the Bermuda stem maggot. Mike is now, he's southeast agronomist. That's where, again, first identified the stem maggot in 14. So that was 11 years ago. What was you seeing this year in southeast?
We had counties downstairs.
What's that? Custer, it was? Okay. All right. So I want to introduce Mr. Mike Trammell. Mike is our area agronomist in Southeast Oklahoma, a wealth of forage knowledge. Glad to have him here today, and he's going to talk a little bit about alfalfa variety selection. He's going to talk about alfalfa variety selection. Okay. And what's the other thing you're talking about? Winter dormancy, fall dormancy? So again, y'all welcome Mike.
Get Mike.
Everybody hear me okay? Okay, we'll talk about alfalfa. This is a crop I've had a lot of experience with. When I started my first job in extension in the early 90s at the University of Nebraska, I was put in charge of alfalfa variety testing. And at that time, I had 8 locations from one end of Nebraska to the other, from basically Scottsbluff to Lincoln, east and west, all the way up from Connors up in the northeast, all the way down to Cozad along the Platte River, which is sub-irrigated. A lot of testing there. We were like 4th in the nation at the time for alfalfa production. So I spent a lot of time with forages, but I spent a lot of time with alfalfa. And over the years too, I've grow a lot of it myself, and I've also had for many years was the plant breeder at the Noble Institute, and this was one of the crops I worked on. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of alfalfa. I always find this interesting to talk about, or look at where some of these crops originated from. And so if we look at alfalfa, we're talking about this area up here that I got circled in red, modern day Iran, Iraq. What was this area called back thousands of years ago? What would we refer to this area? Persia. About 450 BC, something happened in Persia. A young man that was quite keen on seeing the known world and taking over most of it. Anybody knows what this guy's name was? Alexander the Great. Basically, we can call this the point of origin for alfalfa. In about, like I said, 450, 490 BC, Alexander was doing a lot of campaigning through the Middle East there. And one of his favorite military items to bring along was his cavalry, horses. What makes good horse feed? Alfalfa. So alfalfa was actually around long before that. But Alexander the Great is credited for moving alfalfa out of the Middle East. You can actually genomically trace some of these points of origin based on his campaigns through the Middle East. Eventually ended up in Greece. Basically from Greece, it spread into the European areas, down into North Africa. Eventually with the Spaniards bringing it into Mexico, moving it down into Central America and South America. Eventually made it into California in the mid-1800s and Utah, Georgia in about probably around 1730 or so. And so that's always found that kind of interesting. The other thing is kind of, the alfalfa is the name we call it, Arabic word. Some rough translations. I've seen a lot of different ones. Best horse fodder, father of food, best forage. I've seen a lot of different names. One translation actually translates into horsepower. So I always thought that was kind of interesting. But so yeah, we can actually genomically trace the point of origin back to Persia, and a lot of that was spread based on those cavalry campaigns and then bringing that alfalfa forage along with them to feed those horses. The other thing I find interesting, we'll take a look at some interesting pictures here. You always hear like forage production and stuff. There's an art and a science to it. Well, we'll talk about science, but I also find it kind of interesting to look at some of the art part too. So a lot of different places I've been, a lot of museums my wife likes to go to. She always thinks it's funny that I find pictures of forages, such as this picture. This is in the National Museum at Boston. Picture of an alfalfa field. Name of it is Hain. But we can also look at old pictures. California Central Valley. These are historic photos. Here's our horsepower out there harvesting that alfalfa. A lot of alfalfa stacked. I think this is probably in the Sacramento Valley there. A lot of vegetables in this area now, and almonds. We grow a lot of almonds. A lot of this ground's been replaced with those types of crops. Here's a gentleman out in his old car in the alfalfa field. I hope that was his field. Otherwise, his neighbor's probably not going to be too happy with the guy out there driving around in his alfalfa field. How about this one? Poland China hogs in an alfalfa pasture near Virgil, Kansas between 1910 and 1920. And if you can kind of read this, it says more than corn is needed to fatten hogs and to keep them healthy. They thrive on red clover. In recent years, alfalfa has been more and more used as a forage crop. It is rich in the food that cattle, horses, and hogs need and grows much more rapidly than red clover. It can withstand dry weather and moreover is a good fertilizer for the soil. The first thing is, how many of you have planted a pasture of red clover for hogs? So I don't believe I've seen that. How many have seen a pasture of alfalfa that was being grazed by hogs? Yeah, I've actually got one producer I work with that does that. So, but like this is near Virgil, Kansas. This is one of those old photos, you know, you stick one of them bifocal type lens things. So I think Virgil, Kansas is what, south of Emporia, somewhere in there. So, but kind of interesting. We tend to have used a lot of forages in the past. We tend to forget about how we used them sometimes. Historical photo from Oklahoma Historical Society, harvesting hay in Oklahoma. This was 1910. Best I could tell, what I could find out from the photo, this was probably around the Chickasha area. Postcards. See a lot of postcards. I've seen a lot of old historic postcards talked about alfalfa. This one is talking about Darien and El Dorado County, California. Low foothills, abundant winter range, high mountains, excellent summer pasture. Now is the time to investigate these opportunities. Land is large tracts and available for cheap. I bet you it's not anymore. So anyway, but interesting that, you know, alfalfa plays such a part in our culture. So much so, you can even see it on record. I don't know if anybody here is a Graham Parsons, you know, likes to listen to Graham Parsons. This is 1970 album here, right after he got booted out of that band called the Flying Burrito Brothers. But, you know, here it is, hauling alfalfa. And this is actually a photo I took in Argentina. I thought was pretty interesting. This is actually grazing pure alfalfa stands under rotation. Done quite a bit over there. Pretty symmetrical type photo. You can see had really nice areas that he'd grazed here. Moving through here, done quite regular by this producer. But over the years, I've heard a lot of, you know, reasons why people don't grow alfalfa or they've moved away from it, whether it's blister beetles, too risky, lack of marketing skills, not enough labor. I don't want to work that hard. A lot of different reasons for maybe why people weren't growing it or moved away from it in over the years. But it's not a new crop to us. Really was in the 1800s, it kind of took off throughout the southern U.S. Acreage went up for quite a few years, especially into the early 1900s, maybe up to about the mid 1900s. Then the alfalfa weevil came along and that really damaged a lot of crops. No resistance to that. Didn't have any sprays at the time. A lot of folks moved away from growing alfalfa. Since then, really, if you look, you know, a lot of acreage in the South has remained relatively low. This was always one issue. Production problems such as lack of modern, well-adapted varieties, especially for the South. A lot of stuff was developed, but it went north to dairy states, but not much for the South. So we always had varieties that were limited in yield and limited in persistence. Plus, you know, at times there when synthetic fertilizer was low, a lot of people weren't interested in planting that. So I actually had a producer tell me once that, why would I plant alfalfa? Granddad planted that Bermuda grass over there decades ago and it's still there. Why would I plant something that might be there 5 years? So a lot of different reasons why somebody may not use alfalfa in the system. But there's beginning to be a lot more interest with alfalfa, especially probably in this area from interseeding it to improve our Bermuda grass forage quality, get that free nitrogen fixation as well. So a lot of the issues I have seen though with alfalfa has gone back to variety selection. Stand didn't last very long, didn't do well, something happened, go back, see what variety it is. The variety was totally wrong for that type of environment. And selecting the right variety is crucial because if you want any kind of stand longevity, it doesn't matter what it yields if it doesn't persist. So we need to have that persistence. Choosing poorly can lead to stand failure. We want to get a stand that's consistent, starts off well, gives us high quality production in our environment for multiple years. So if you look at the criteria for selecting a variety, we'll talk about this, but it's adaptation to the region. Fall dormancy being the first. We'll talk about winter hardiness. And then we'll talk about our disease and insect resistance. And that all goes back into persistence, forage quality, and yield potential. So selecting the right alfalfa variety, the first thing I'm going to look at is fall dormancy. How many is really familiar with what fall dormancy is? So I think it's probably the most misunderstood trait there is with alfalfa, and it's the most important one when we're going to select a variety. But you can measure fall dormancy on a scale of 1 to 11, with 1 being extremely dormant and 11 being non-dormant. In this area here in Oklahoma, we'd be at about 4 to 6, maybe some 7s if we're down here on the Red River Valley. Depending on the weather, I've grew some 8s, but 4, 5, and 6 are pretty common to grow in this area. And basically what we're measuring is autumn growth. Fall dormancy is a measure of autumn growth. The growth I get in the fall up to a killing freeze. A good example of that is if you look at these pots here from 1 to 11, this is an extremely non-dormant variety. This is the amount of growth I would get in the fall before we go into winter. This is a non-dormant variety. This is a dormancy 11, basically has no dormancy. I might grow that in Southern California in the Imperial Valley, cut that 12 months out of the year, never goes dormant. Where would I want to maybe grow something like this? The Dakotas, Southern Canada. But this gives you an idea of this chart here from very dormant to very non-dormant. If we get into like 7 and 8, not very winter hardy, good fall and late winter growth. Why would I want some growth like this? Say, for example, I got it interseeded in some Bermuda. Bermuda goes dormant. I still got some green alfalfa in there. It might cover that forage gap until I can go on to maybe a small grain winter forage or a fescue pasture or something. High quality forage to cover that gap. This is a photo I took in El Centro, California, southern part of California, kind of give you an idea of dormancy. It was taken on January 12th of that year. These are all fall dormancy 8s that you can see with lots of growth. This is a fall dormancy 4. This fall dormancy 4 is what I consider an all-purpose. From Nebraska down in Texas, I grow a 4. You can see not a lot of fall growth. This is a fall dormancy 5. See the difference in the growth here? And then here to an 8. So if I'm running a 3 or 4 here, I could be shorting myself a lot of yield that I may, could have got out of the fall. So we need to think about that. So this is the main trait you would just select for first. If I'm looking to get a variety, I'm going to select this first and then build on that. A little bit more about dormancy. Less dormancy is associated with higher yield, faster regrowth, higher fiber though, earlier flowering time. So this is a little experiment done on some dormancies after 7 days after cutting. You can see a fall dormancy 1, little to no growth. 5 is kind of moderate. Look how much growth the 11, fall dormancy 11 put on. That's 1 week after cutting. And basically, if you plot this fall dormancy, if you look on the fall dormancy ratings compared to tonnage on yield, these varieties up here, 7, 8, and 9 dormancies produce a lot of tonnage compared to ones that are dormant. Tonnage drops quite a bit. But the thing is, if I produce a lot of tonnage, my quality is lower. You can see NDF tends to go up because I'm building fiber quicker. While these dormant varieties, 3, 4s, and 5s, I'm not getting the yield, but what yield I get is usually of higher quality. Plant types associated with dormancy. Here's a dormancy 1. You can see it's a very decumbent plant. It's very flat, very low growing to the ground. While 4s, 5s, 7s tend to be more of a moderate type plant, where if I'm a dormancy, say 8, 9, 10, 11, where I exhibit really no dormancy, very erect, very fast growing tall plant. Talk about winter survival. I hear this term used both ways, either winter hardiness or winter survival. Basically, it's a scale range 2 of 1 to 6. It's related back to dormancy. The most appropriate winter hardiness scores for Oklahoma are about 3 to 4, which gives us a moderate winter hardiness. It's basically a measure of that plant's ability to survive the winter without injury, where, that's kind of, winter hardiness is that plant's ability to change its physiology going into winter to reduce its chance of dying through that or acclimating to those cold temperatures. So its relationship to dormancy. Here's a study Dan Undersander did up in Wisconsin. This is data from Wisconsin and Minnesota. You can see dormancies of 1 out to, or 2 to 5 here, and winter survival. Got pretty good winter survival of those dormancies. Once we start getting into 5s or higher, we had very little survival or none at all. So basically, these that survived here, what do you think helped them survive in Wisconsin or Minnesota? Snow cover, insulation. And that kind of goes back, we're getting those northern varieties tend to be lower dormancy, higher quality, which works well for what? Dairies. So that's where a lot of the emphasis has been put over the years for alfalfa production. So fall dormancy, winter survival can be confusing. So how do I choose? Pretty simple. Just plant the least dormant type that will survive the winter in your region. So here, we're going, say, to 4s to 7s. I want to try to get as much production as I can. I'm probably going to push a 7. Try to get what I can out of it. Get that extra cutting. That last cutting is usually of higher quality too. Sure. Uh-huh.
I'd rather leave it, make sure that in goes to bed and stay cool.
So it depends how hard you want to push your forage production. If you don't need it, then don't worry about it. But if you yeah, so the key is when you're pushing that last harvest, a lot of folks are kind of like a little afraid to take it, but because it could be not a, depending on what dormancy you planted, it could be some pretty, good tonnage, and it's usually really high quality. But I do want to I want to get a hard freeze, probably wait about 48 hours, and then cut it. So that's kind of the key. Then I'm okay with letting it go to bed. But I don't want to cut it and then get a hard freeze on it that night or the next day or so. But, with these more non-dormant varieties, it is a trade-off with winter survival. but most of these varieties have to be hit extremely, extremely hard before you start losing plants basically to winter survival. So to find out these ratings, you can go into the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance, alfalfa.org. They publish this booklet every year with all the new varieties in it. And the main thing in the front of that book to select a variety is fall dormancy. So, you know, if I'm looking to do a fall dormancy 6, I'm going to go to the fall dormancy 6 selection. Then I'm going to start selecting other things, my disease package, my resistance to insects, and so on. I was asked once about, well, how do they come up with fall dormancy? A lot of these tests for alfalfa are standardized. Everybody across the country does the same type of test. Corteva has an alfalfa and they want to release it. They have to go through these tests, Pioneer, so on. So fall dormancy is a standardized test. This is a space plant trial that was being conducted for fall dormancy. These are the check varieties that everybody uses, from Maverick down to UC 1465, which has no dormancy at all. So these are always planted in the trial to compare those populations you're interested in against where it can be assigned a fall dormancy rating. Basically, these plants are put out there. We take about a harvest in around here, it would be around mid-September, we would take a harvest, and then we would measure growth probably to about October 15th, measure that growth, and then we can regress that back against those checks and assign that variety of fall dormancy. We talk about disease and insect resistance. It's always important to look at those disease packages and pest resistant packages. You want to select varieties that are resistant to the most recurring alfalfa pests and diseases in your area. But to kind of understand how those are assigned, we kind of need to talk about a little bit what an alfalfa variety is. And it's defined as a population of individuals. So basically, if I had a bag of alfalfa seed and I dumped it all out on this table, it's all the same population, but every seed is different. It's heterogeneous and heterozygous all at the same time. And so that's why when we do disease ratings and stuff, and you see those, they're characterized by percentages because it's not exact. So for example, if we take wheat, which is pure inbred lines, or corn, which is a cross of two inbreds for a hybrid, every seed tends to be the same. But if we look at alfalfa, it's a synthetic population. So every seed in that bag is different. It expresses things differently than the seed next to it. So that's why when we do disease package and pest resistance, it's characterized by percentages. So when you see something that says it's moderately resistant to fusarium wilt, it's basically saying that 15 to 30% of those plants that's grown out of that bag is resistant to that wilt. If you buy something that's highly resistant to leafhopper, it could be that only 51% of those bags exhibit high resistance to leafhopper because it's percentage. Everything's expressed differently. Not every seed in that bag's the same. And these are kind of the ratings that you see: susceptible, low resistance, all the way up to high resistance. So for example, if you take the kind of blue there, if that's resistant plants, and I did a population, say I did 5 different tests, and this is what come out, I would rate this variety based on that as highly resistant. Because 50% of the plants in each population showed up as resistant. Here, maybe only 51%, but it's still classified as highly resistant. So this is a test for Phytophthora root rot that was done in a greenhouse. And if we kind of look at this on percentages, so if we look at, like, say, this tray here, highly susceptible, maybe only about less than 5% of the plants survived, that would get a rating of susceptible. We're here, maybe this tray, near more than 50% of the plants survive, so we'd rate that as highly resistant. Here's a resistant variety. 31 to 50% of the plants survived that Phytophthora root rot. So you can see there's some variation, quite a bit of variation in those tests. Major diseases around here, root rots, Phantomyces, Phytophthora, especially important. Stem rot or white mold, highly destructive, especially if we in the spring. But if we have dry winters, we don't seem to see that too much. Phytophthora root rot's big problem in both new seedlings and established stands, especially in poorly drained soils. And Phantomyces root rot, really big disease and significant problem in seedling alfalfa in cool, wet periods. And then we have anthracnose, kind of causes crown and stem rot, reducing yield to stand life, especially in, which humid areas, which we are most of the times. Or wilts, bacteria, fusarium, and verticulum, very important. Stem and leaf diseases, of course, anthracnose I mentioned, spring black stem can be an issue as well. Pest occurrence, probably late winter, early spring, cutworms and aphids, especially the pea and blue aphid. I see pea and blue aphid quite a bit. And then, of course, the alfalfa weevil. You can pretty much set your calendar around here, it seems like, to spray for alfalfa weevil. In the summer, still have some aphids, maybe the spotted aphid, foliage feeding caterpillars. Here is some blue aphids here on a stem. I don't know. Here's alfalfa weevil damage. You can see some of that's been pained out by the weevils. They can cause significant damage pretty quickly if not scouted. The alfalfa weevil, that's one test you will see in that alfalfa. It's not there because we just don't have any resistance to it. Well, we'll see resistance tests to pea aphids, spotted aphids, blue aphids, nematodes, a lot of different things, but you will not see any alfalfa weevil resistance. So it's a major issue we have to deal with. Other pests, grasshoppers, leafhoppers, some of our plant bugs, and of course, blister beetles. Very important from the standpoint, if we're doing horse hay. So if we go back to that ratings book and say I'm interested in a fall dormancy 4, that's the main thing I choose first. And then I could build my disease packages from there for what I want for my area. I can go through here and I can see a bacterial wilt for Integra is highly resistant to verticulum wilt. So that means what? At least 50% of the seed I plant of that variety is going to be resistant to verticulum. And so we got pea aphid, blue aphid. You can see here, no resistance or the test was never done. Potato leaf hopper, stem nematodes. Then we start getting into some other traits here. Continuous grazing tolerance, standability expression, salt tolerance. You can also go in, if you know a variety, maybe your neighbor plants a variety, you can type it in, go through and look at the different things, Phytophthora and Phantomyces, race 1 or 2, southern root knot, different things you can look at. This all goes back to persistence. Like I said, if we don't have persistence, it doesn't really matter what we yield because the stand's not going to be there for any type of longevity. So really want to pick those packages out well. If it's a grazing type variety, we want to look at that. This is some old photos from, this would have been the early 80s, early 80s. Development of dual purpose alpha graze, the original grazing alfalfa. That was actually selected out of Florida 77, several cycles of selection pressure, and they come up with alpha graze under continuous grazing. So that was the original alpha graze variety there. We also see that wheel traffic tested varieties that stand up to wheel traffic also tend to be very grazing resistant as well because they stand up to hoof traffic very well. This is some data from Charlie Brummer. It was done out in Iowa where he looked at some grazing resistant varieties under continuous stocking and rotational. So he had 2 varieties that were grazing intolerant compared to 2 varieties that were grazing tolerant. And basically what they've seen is the cultivars that were grazing intolerant separated out, and they separated out even quicker under continuous stocking compared to rotational. So the stand life on those did not last as long as the varieties that were selected under grazing. So there is, if you're interested in a grazing variety, that'll be a heading that you can select under on your package. Yield potential. Like I said, when I started in Nebraska many years ago, I would have 500 to 600 alfalfa varieties entered to plant in various parts. That's a commercial and experimental lines. This is something you don't see anymore is a lot of variety trials. And there's not as many seed companies anymore developing alfalfas. Now it's just a handful of companies. So we don't see that quite as much anymore. There are a few. New Mexico does a large variety trial each year. Forage quality. We see a lot of this now. Selection for high fiber digestibility. You can see here we have 5 stems of an improved variety selected for better leaf stem to ratio. You can see the leaves there. Were 5 stems of variety that was not selected for leaf to stem ratio. These are usually, if you have a variety, you see HQ next to it, it says high quality. That's usually selection for that. And then lodging resistance. Conventional alfalfa variety here compared to one that has some resistance to lodging. Picture there. And that can lead to some tonnage loss, as much of 1/10 of a ton per acre per inch of stubble left in the field. So it can be pretty important under certain conditions for lodging in some areas. And, I had one producer once, he liked to do his own variety trials. He would plant different varieties and decide which one he wanted and do different things. So if you have sometimes a variety you're interested in, maybe you pick up a bag and just do a strip before you plant a whole field, look at some different varieties and see what you think. But it's really all tied together in stamp resistance, your disease package, our pest resistance, by looking at lodging or trampling. There's some out there, there's even a selection for saline type environments to build your package for a proper selection. But this is all built on top of fall dormancy. And kind of one of the guys I worked for years ago told me, if you want to get the most out of a new variety, requires optimal management, but don't expect it to bail you out if your management is poor. So a lot of these are just as good as the management you put on them. And with that, I'll leave you with a lot of different alfalfa flower colors there. Everybody feels comfortable selecting their alfalfa variety. I don't think so. Not for alfalfa, I don't think. No.
When you get your varieties selected, ready for you, how many years do you think that stand should last?
Well,
Good management.
good management. If I was doing optimal management, I would expect a high producing stand for 5 years. Now, 5 years means that going into 6, 7, if I'm losing that stand, I'm probably going to plant grass back over it and have a mixed system. I'm going to use it somehow. That's kind of one of those, your idea of management and mine may be, I may take it out in 3 years and say, I'm just not getting the high level of tonnage I want. I'm going to take it out after 3.
But if you spent $400 on that bag of alfalfa, you thought money in 3
Yeah.
years.
So I'm gonna go a minimum of 5. I got to get 5 years out of it.
Think you can interseed back into that stand without it protein on the back?
No, not with autotoxicity. I put grass back in that. Put grass over the top of that alfalfa. Cut it for hay that way or something, or graze it.
What kind of fertility program do you suggest?
So alfalfa is kind of, we're getting the nitrogen fixation out of it, but it is a luxury user of potassium. So, in stands that have not lasted very long that I've seen, the potassium levels were never kept up. So I'd always keep potassium at, based on your soil test up to level, along with your phosphorus as well. Those are the two main things. So at seeding, I would kind of top off the tank on phosphorus and potassium and seed that stand. And then going into that next year, take a soil test. You may have to add 100 units of phosphorus or potassium, depending on that then. But it's usually the second going into third year, really, once those roots really get down in there, they're really going to start sucking the tank dry on potassium if you don't add it. You could.
Do you think there's any difference between disc mowers? Of course, the standard have been for a long time. Think there's any difference between disc mower and a sickle on regrowth?
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen it go both. I could say I've seen it go both ways, I guess. I've always used a disc. I think somebody else had it. Did somebody else over here? Yeah, right here. What do you think? Boron foliar, alfalfa.
I've got to find it to make something different to pay for it.
Yeah. I've seen it sprayed on some stands before, and I didn't see any difference.
Okay. Okay, last speaker. We got one more today. Last speaker here is going to be Miss Josie Rice. She's a PhD candidate here in the department from Northeast Fairfax, the Osage. Okay. She's worked on nitrates in sorghum for both her master's and now her PhD. So she's going to talk a little bit about some of the findings of that across both of her degrees.
Ready? Let me get. Where do you put this thing? Oh, can I just stick it in here like this? Okay. All right. Can y'all hear me okay? I'll try not to keep you too long. I know y'all are probably ready to get out of here. So, as Josh said, my name's Josie Rice. I'm a PhD candidate, and today I'm going to talk to y'all a little bit about grain and forage sorghum nitrate management. So what are nitrates? Nitrates are a natural form of nitrogen taken up by plants during growth. What causes those nitrates to build up? Mainly stressors, whether that be we're in a drought all summer and then we get a rain, cloudy weather, whatever that may be. Most of the time it's those stressors that are going to cause those nitrates to build. So when a ruminant consumes a high nitrate forage, it goes into the rumen as nitrate. It's then further converted down to nitrite and then normally converted to ammonia. However, when we have those excess nitrates, they don't fully get converted to ammonia and they turn into methemoglobin, which is a form of hemoglobin that lacks oxygen carrying capabilities. So for a little bit about nitrate level interpretations, we generally consider 0 to 3,000 parts per million safe for all cattle. When we get into that 3,000 to 5,000 range, that's when we do see a risk, mainly generally safe for non-pregnant beef cattle. Where we see the risk at is in pregnant cattle or in dairy cattle there, as dairy cattle need to be below 2,500 parts per million. When we get to that 5,000 to 10,000 part per million range, we do start seeing a risk for all cattle there. We may start to see some mid to late term abortions or weak newborn calves. We can also see a decrease in growth and milk production. And then when we hit that 10,000 range, that's where we really start seeing issues, as that's potentially toxic for all cattle, and that's where we can start seeing death occur. So getting into this forage sorghum, sorghums are prone to nitrate accumulations. Most of those nitrates are going to accumulate in that bottom 6 to 12 inches of that stalk. Those nitrates can stay high even after regrowth because uptake can be faster than conversion. One way we can kind of combat that is by ensiling. That can reduce nitrate levels by 30 to 60%. We still run a risk though when we look at grazing or green chopping. So getting into a little bit of data here. This was Perkins forage sorghum cut number 1 of 2025 this year. We weren't expecting to get 2 cuttings off of this, but with our warm fall we had extended that out a little bit, and we ended up being able to get 2 cuttings pulled off of this. So to set this graph up a little bit for you, our orange bars are going to be a 50-pound in rate, our blue bars are going to be a 0-pound in rate, and then we have 4 different varieties here. So we also, on the y-axis, that's our nitrate in parts per million. We do have some pretty high nitrates here. Not the highest I've ever seen, but definitely at toxic levels. So when we look at these first 2 Advanta varieties, the 56525 with the 50-pound in rate and the 0-pound in rate, when we compare those to the Altaseeds 9301 with the 0-pound in rate, we do see a significant difference there. However, all of the rest of them were comparable to both of those. So what this kind of tells us maybe is that depending on looking at nitrogen application alone isn't necessarily going to cause those nitrates to accumulate. Looking at this, it's probably more of a variety difference. This is Perkins forage sorghum cut 2. This was pulled off in late October. We do see a little bit of decline in nitrates. We did run statistics on this, but we didn't have an interaction between variety and nitrogen application with the nitrate. This goes back to, once again, probably not a nitrogen application issue, more of a varietal difference. Then we get into LCV forage sorghum, so Lake Carl Blackwell forage sorghum from this year. These are really low nitrates. The highest we see is 160 parts per million, so really nothing. And that is in the 0-pound application of nitrogen. When we look at the 60-pound application of nitrogen, it is a little bit lower, almost by half. What this maybe tells us is that this plant was maybe stressed, because no in application can be a stress to that plant. Now we're getting into Perkins forage sorghum sectioning. This is part of my PhD work. We kind of wanted to look at how this nitrogen was stratified within plants. So what we did was we took a full plant sample to the ground, 18 inches to the ground, 12 inches to the ground, and 6 inches to the ground. And then we have the different N rates. The blues are 0 N rate and the oranges are 50. And what we can kind of see here is a lot of these nitrates are concentrated in that bottom 12 to 6 inches. We do see that 18-inch has, at the 50-pound N rate, it does have higher N rates, higher nitrate, but a lot of those nitrates are accumulating in that bottom 6 to 12 inches. This was from this year, Lake Carl Blackwell forage sorghum sectioning. And when we look at this, once again, we have relatively low nitrates, not toxic levels whatsoever. But when we look at that 6-inch 0 applied in, we do see that that is the highest N rate that we see, the highest nitrate part per million that we see. However, once again, that probably goes back to no application of N, which is a stressor for that plant. So concluding on forage sorghum nitrates, the nitrate concentrations did vary widely among hybrids and between cuttings, indicating that maybe we're seeing a hybrid specific response. Those nitrogen rate effects on nitrate accumulation were variable and not strictly linear, which may tell us that these nitrate concentrations probably depended more on hybrid and cutting, suggesting that probably in application alone didn't necessarily drive nitrate accumulation. Cut timing and regrowth stage influence nitrate levels, with those second cut values often being lower. And those nitrate concentrations were stratified within that plant, typically observed in those lower 6 to 12 inches. So now getting into impact of management on nitrate toxicity of grain sorghum residue following harvest. This was some of my master's work that I did. So a lot of our producers do value grain sorghum as it is a good rotation option, has a high heat tolerance. But our growers have kind of been looking for ways that they can minimize risk and expand on economic opportunities. So one way we can do that is by integrating grazing residues. Once again, those nitrates can accumulate in that stover after we've pulled that grain off. And not all of those nitrates, once again, are dangerous just when we have a high level of accumulation. So this is forage nitrates for Bixby 2022. I know this graph looks like a lot, but I'll set it up here for you. So on the bottom, on the x-axis, we have a non-treated treatment, a black layer treatment, and a black layer plus 30% treatment. What those treatments are desiccation treatments. So black layer, we put out a desiccation treatment at black layer plus 30%. That was roughly 2 weeks after we hit black layer that desiccation treatment went out. And then the blue bars are at harvest sampling. The orange bars would be 1 month after. And then the gray bars would be 2 months after. And then once again, we have those forage nitrates on the y-axis. So when we look at the statistics on this, looking at the big letters denote significant difference between treatments. So when we compare the at harvest, the 1 month delayed and the 2 month delayed, and the non-treated, we see a significant difference in each of those. When we look at the black layer, we see a significant difference between the at harvest and the 2 month delayed. But that 1 month delayed was comparable to both of those. And then when we get to that black layer plus 30%, we see a significant difference when we compare that at harvest and 1 month delayed to that 2 month delayed. Now getting into the little letters, those denote significant difference between the harvest timings. So when we compare the non-treated to the black layer plus 30% at harvest, those were all significantly different from each other. When we look at the 1 month delayed, the non-treated and the black layer plus 30% were different from each other. And then that black layer treatment was comparable to both of those. And then when we get to our 2 month delayed, follows the same trend as our black layer treatment did, or our 1 month delay did. That non-treated and black layer were significantly different from each other. And then that black layer plus 30% treatment, and then that black layer treatment was comparable to both of those. Not super high nitrates, maybe a little bit of risk there at harvest, but other than that, they tend to go down as we delay harvest. So for forage nitrates for Perkins for 2023, we didn't necessarily have a interaction between both of those. That's why these graphs look a little different. So this is just strictly comparing treatments. Those treatments are the same, non-treated, the black layer desiccation application, and then the black layer plus 30% desiccation application. So we see a non-treated, when we look at the non-treated, we see a significant difference when we compare it and the black layer plus 30% to that black layer treatment. Probably mid nitrates, around that 5,000 part per million. So there is a risk there. Not super sky high though. And then when we look at the harvest timing, when we compare that at harvest and that 1 month delayed to that 2 month delayed, we see a significant difference there. As you can see, those nitrates did decline. Roughly at harvest, we were sitting at about 6,000 parts per million. 1 month delayed, we're sitting at probably about 5,800 parts per million. And then by that 2-month delayed, we're sitting at about 2,000 parts per million. So in conclusion on my grain sorghum nitrates, desiccation treatments did not consistently reduce forage nitrate concentrations compared to the non-treated control, indicating that desiccation timing did not impact nitrates. Harvest interval, however, though, did have a greater influence on nitrate concentrations. When we look at that delayed harvest, it often did result in lower nitrate concentrations. Those lower nitrate concentrations occurred over time, regardless of the desiccation treatment, suggesting that maybe it's driven by post-maturity physiological processes and environmental exposure rather than actual chemical desiccation. And changes in forage nitrate concentrations were primarily by crop maturity and time after harvest rather than those desiccation treatments, suggesting that desiccation does not alter those nitrate dynamics. And with that, thank you, and I'll take any questions.